Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming on a late Friday night. For those who came to our two-day conference, this is very much the climax of the Richard Wallace celebrations. It's his 200th year anniversary. We've been looking at him as a collector, comparing him to collectors of his own time, discussing what he was up to when he came to London with the collection, how he exhibited it, what he bought, and our curators then finished off by focusing on very specific objects that he acquired that makes the Wallace quite distinctive to other museums here in London, and what makes up the Wallace Collection. Now, of course, the museum opened in 1900. It was given to the British nation by Lady Wallace, and it was open to the public. The Prince of Wales was there, and there was a great fanfare, a lot of a great happiness that the British had been given this collection that for a long time nobody really knew what was going to happen to it. Of course, the French thought they were going to get it, and I've got Olivier here who probably liked to think that it should have come to Paris, but it didn't. It came here to London, and we are very lucky that we can admire it and come to it every day for free, because it's a government museum. But of course, it is now the 21st century, and you know, it's difficult. The government is not giving us as much money as it used to. Our grant and aid has been reduced significantly. We get 40% from them, and the 60% we have to fundraise ourselves. And I'm not the only one as the director of the Wallace Collection, because I am joined by esteemed colleagues from the world. I've got Olivier Gabet here from the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. I've got Ian Wardropper from the Frick Museum, New York. I've got an artist, a living artist, Jakob Beugel, who is our current resident artist. I've got Emilie Gordenker from the Mauritshuis in Holland, and I've got Christian Levett, who is a collector and has opened a museum down in the south of France around his collection. And all six of us are going to have a live discussion, discussing the challenges that we have, but also how important we feel that these small museums are in today's world. We are surrounded by the great national galleries, the V&As, the Metropolitan, the Louvre, the Rijksmuseum, Mougins, what's near Mougins, the Musée Picasso. Anyway, basically, we need to do whatever we can to bring our audiences to our museums. So before we start discussing things, I've asked each of our speakers to really sort of say something about their museum, how it was founded, what's inside these museums, and how are they funded. So I'm going to pass over to Emilie, who is going to start off with the Mauritshuis. Thank you, Emilie.
Thank you very much, Xavier, and lovely to have you all here. Let me just see. Yes. Now my talk is going to be in two sections, because the Mauritshuis, which is in The Hague, I'll show you a picture. There we are. Actually has a kind of bifurcated history. The building has a history of its own. As you can see, it's right in the heart of the city. The little round tower to the right is our Prime Minister's office. So we are in the current government, but formerly the court. The building was commissioned by Johann Maurits of Nassau-Siegen. So Mauritshuis means Maurits's house. It's confusingly not Prince Moritz, but Johann Maurits, who was a great military figure who was then asked by the West Indies Company to become governor in Brazil. And during his Brazilian time, he had this house built for himself by the Renzo Piano of his day, Jacob van Campen. You might know the great palace on Dam Square, which was built as Amsterdam City Hall, was by the same architect, and it's a spectacular example of Dutch classicist architecture. When Johann Maurits returned from Brazil, he came back carrying with him a number of artifacts, Brazilian artifacts. Sadly, that legacy is pretty much dispersed. He gave his paintings by Franz Post, an artist who was with him in Brazil, to Louis XIV. They are now in the Louvre, some of them the major ones, and so forth. But it always had a bit of a legacy as a place to show collections. That having been said, it wasn't a museum formally until our first king, William I, decided that his collection, I'll come back to it in a moment, should be housed here as the Royal Picture Gallery. As a house, it has a challenge. It wasn't intended to be a museum. And I'm showing you now the other side. You may have heard that we recently expanded the building, renovated it, and to include the brick building across the street, which is our new wing. 1930s building, wonderful example of Dutch Art Deco, has nothing to do with the Mauritshuis. So it was a real challenge to integrate the two. That having been said, it was very necessary for us. So I was talking to Jakob just now. He remembers going to the Mauritshuis before our renovation. Any of you been there before? Yes. And you had to go literally as a servant through the side entrance and then only take a stairs up. We now have a proper entrance, and I'll show you some images of what that looked like now. So you come in through the gate, which is a big symbol of our project. We opened the gates to the forecourt. And you come downstairs and you see this wonderful modern foyer, as we call it. From there, you take the steps up into the historic building, which we have also entirely renovated. And you will see that it maintains its character as a private house, like something akin to what we have here. Mostly in the style of the 18th century, which was the last time the house was really thoroughly remodeled. And here, of course, is the famous room with our girl with a pearl earring. So we tried to keep the feel of the 18th century, but we did decide, let's not kid around. It is a fantastic collection, and we should show it as a picture collection should be, with great lighting and the proper types of colors on the walls and so forth. This is a shot of the new wing. It's an education space and conference center. I sadly didn't bring a shot of our temporary exhibition space, but it looks a bit like the picture on the lower right. And we may come back to that in our discussion of what we do with temporary exhibitions. But what this essentially meant for us is where previously we had to do shows in this area, take down the permanent collection. We now have a very flexible space that looks something like this in which to do exhibitions. We currently have a show on of 21 Dutch paintings from the National Trust. I'm looking at Alistair Lang. Last time this happened, a show like this happened, was Alistair's great show at the National Gallery, which was quite a long time ago. Now, very quickly to the collection, has a very different history. I'm showing you a portrait of the last stadtholder of the Netherlands, Prince William V. The Netherlands, confusingly, did not have kings until after the French period. And he was an absolutely disastrous stadtholder because it was during his time that Napoleon's troops invaded, but he was an outstanding collector. And his pictures still today form the core of our collection. So, for example, our great bull by Paulus Potter. Can you imagine this went to the Louvre? It's kind of unbelievable. And this was the picture for which I think Jakob, your grandfather, probably took you to the Mauritshuis. It was our great claim to fame, but we have great other works. The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolaas Tulp by Rembrandt, on the insistence of King William I, bought for his Mauritshuis. The Great View of Delft by Johannes Vermeer. Vermeer was discovered in the period after the Mauritshuis was set up, and of course our current icon, the girl with the pearl earring. But it doesn't stop there. We also have, for example, the Goldfinch by Karel Fabricius, which has become more famous recently. There's going to be a film that comes out next year, so I think we're going to get lots of traffic for that. And we continue to collect. I'm very, very proud to announce that we made this new acquisition. We announced it yesterday, a painting by Willem Buitenweg, extremely rare. It's one of 6 paintings by his hand. He's better known as a draftsman. And so we continue to collect. Just to wrap up, because I know you asked about how we're funded, we are a Rijksmuseum. Rijksmuseum means National Museum in Dutch. There are just short of 30 of us in the Netherlands, which means we receive a subsidy from the Ministry of Culture, which does 2 things. It pays the rent. So obviously it's very strange. We take a portion of the subsidy and send it to another ministry, the Government Buildings Agency, whom you know very well. And the rest we use to maintain and care for the collection, which is owned by the ministry itself. I'm technically the director of a private foundation with a supervisory board. And then we have a number of members' organizations. So it's a quite complicated governance structure. To give you a sense of how challenging it is, we are earning about 80% of our operating budget ourselves and we're not in Amsterdam, and we don't get a huge number of visitors, something we may also come back to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilie. That was a perfect introduction to a museum that I can see has had a lot of attention in the last 10 years under your directorship. Just even your slides and the branding, everything's very clear cut. So I congratulate you on that. And now to Ian, who is director of the Frick and has a lot to tell us as well, and particularly as we consider the Wallace and the Frick as a sort of brotherly institutions. I have to say, however, that Frick came here in 1903 and said that he wanted a similar thing back in New York. So we came first. Sorry about that. But
Absolutely true. We can still remain brothers. So quite a different story, more or less what we call a rags to riches story, except he had a modest background. His Frick's was born in Western Pennsylvania in 1849. His father was an immigrant farmer. His mother's family had a distillery and hardware store. And he had the nouns to figure out the importance of coke, which is a distillation of coal that was necessary to achieve the high temperatures for making steel and iron. So in short order, beginning the time he was 21, he put together a monopoly of 80% of all the coke in the world. And shortly after that, Andrew Carnegie, who wanted a regular supply of the best coke to make iron and steel, brought Frick into the business. So the two of them had a tremendous run. This was all in Pittsburgh in his early days. And what's endearing to me about Frick is that he was interested in art from the beginning. So the Mellon Bank sent somebody, a representative, to interview him for a loan to expand his coking business. And the report came back that he may be a little too interested in pictures, but not enough to hurt, which is, of course, ironical because he was paying record prices towards the end of his career. But the point was he lived in this sort of shack office that was covered with prints and drawings. It was what he could afford. As he began making his fortune in the 1870s, he collected modern, contemporary art. So he knew American painters. He started collecting Barbizon School, English art. And it wasn't until he moved to New York in stages around 1900 that he really started focusing on old master pictures. But he knew what he was doing by that point. He'd been collecting for about 30 years. And so what the Frick is, I think, famous for is a relatively small but exceptional collection of principally European art from the Renaissance through the 19th century. Is first just the sheer quality. He focused on painting, so you see here he was the one who actually hung Sir Thomas More opposite Thomas Cromwell, where they've remained for 100 years, separated by this very dour El Greco portrait. So he bought paintings really well, but as the house was being built between 1912 and 1914 by Carrere and Hastings, famous architectural firm, built the New York Public Library, for example, he recognized that he needed furnishings of the same level of quality. So that's when he starts buying the mix of things, which I think gives this a period charm, which is missing from many American museums today. So there's French 18th century furniture. There's a great collection of Italian Renaissance bronzes. Jeremy just gave a great talk about the bronzes here. Frick had the opportunity of J.P. Morgan's death in 1913 to cherry pick some of the very best bronzes, Limoges enamels. But you also see Boule furniture. That was very much because of coming to the Wallace Collection. He couldn't buy all the Boule that he wanted, so he bought some very good 19th century Boule too. Chinese porcelain. So it's that mix, the intimacy, the sense of it being a private collection that is, I think, what draws people to the Frick today. And so just briefly about its history. So he dies in 1919. His will provides, I'll get back to the financial aspect of this later, but provides for the future of the institution. His wife dies in 1931, and at that point, the trustees have the responsibility of putting his will into an effect. So he wanted to have a public gallery for all people whomsoever, it's a nice phrase, and he wanted to encourage the study of the fine arts and kindred subjects. So displaying art and education were part of the mission from the beginning. The trustees, who included people like John Rockefeller, had to put his will into effect after his wife died. So this is the original house here facing Fifth Avenue, 70th Street. And then this was added There used to be a road that went from 70th Street through a courtyard to 71st Street, and they hired John Russell Pope, who was an architect of his day, who did the National Gallery in Washington, for example, to fill it in and add the library, which is there, one of the great art reference libraries in the world. And the Frick opened to the public in 1935 with 130,000 people then. Like many small museums, we face the growth of our audience, so we now have about 300,000 people, which we weren't built to accommodate. So that's something that the Frick has been looking at for many years. In fact, 5 years after we opened to the public in 1935, the Frick recognized it needed more space. So it started buying townhouses on East 70th Street, one here, two, and this is the third one. So spent 30 years and a lot of money acquiring a parcel of land to build what they refer to as a service wing, which would have more space for conservation, a larger auditorium, education spaces, all the kinds of things that a house museum tends to need and didn't have in the first place. It never happened in the 1970s. It was a rough time financially, so they built this small pavilion here and asked Russell Page, famous British landscape architect, to put a garden up next to it. Now, many of you have probably heard that after the Frick went through, depending on how you count, 5 master plans from 1966 to the present, I proposed going back to the original idea of going onto that site. A lot of people were unhappy with the fact that we would have had to take down this garden. So we listened, we withdrew that plan, and we've now hired another architect, Annabelle Seldorf, to essentially give us the space we need without touching the garden. We're repurposing about 60,000 square feet, and we're adding what you see kind of ghosted in white, about 17,000 square feet above ground. So very discreetly adding what we need. And I don't want to get too deep into the conversation, but basically what we need is more space for art. And to do that, this is Annabelle Seldorf's very, I think, discreet addition, modernist, but using limestone, bronze, and glass. To do that, we are not going to change any of the galleries in red beyond new carpets, new wall hangings. So the old Frick that you know and love will remain the same, but we'll be doubling the size of the reception hall, essentially just giving it its natural width, adding a special exhibition space. Currently, we have to take down the permanent collection if we want to do a paintings exhibition, for example. There is no education space whatsoever currently. So we're adding everything you see in green here, which will allow those programs to flourish. It will also connect to our library. We have one of the great art reference libraries in the world, but you can't go from the collection to the library currently. And then on the second floor, really the heart of it is to open everything you see in orange, beige there, are residential areas, the bedrooms. And there was an idea in 1931 to make this public space. It never happened, but we're proposing to now turn this into gallery space, and our curators are having very interesting conversations about how to use this space. And we'll have our first cafe, we'll have a seating area for people, we will prepare the library for its digital future. So these are some of the things which we're hoping to do. The financial question, just very briefly, Henry Clay Frick left $15 million in 1919, which was a lot of money then. The Frick continued to buy out of that endowment, Piero della Francesca, Duccio, Cimabue. So the endowment was spent down, and we have more programs now, but it still covers about half of our operating costs through interest, and then tickets and fundraising covered the rest.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's a fascinating contrast with what's been done at the Mauritshuis and what you're planning to do. And again, the sort of subtle additions to a very sort of well-loved building it's interesting to hear your approach. Before we again open the discussion, I'm now going to hand over to Olivier, who is, I don't know why we've gone back to, oh, here we are. It looks as if it is Paris, but the Mauritshuis has taken over for some reason.
Well, that's okay.
That's fine, we know. So Olivier Gabet is the director of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs and the Nissim Carmando.
Yeah, so it's another story here too. This museum was opened in 1936, 1 year after the death of the Count Maurice de Camondo, who gave it to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs and to the nation 1 year before in his will. He gave it to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs because the museum was a private museum with national collection. It's another weird system. I mean that the museum was founded in the mid-19th century, like more or less the V&A, the South Kensington Museum. And when he settled in the Pavillon Marsan, and this wing of the Louvre where we are still here, the Board of Trustees decided to give the collection to the nation. And the government was very happy and said, we don't know what to do with this, so get back the collection. And so we are a very weird institution with a private Board of Trustees, but national collection. And Maurice de Camondo was a very important member of the Board of Trustees. He was deputy chairman. And I think that he gave the place and the collection to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs because of this weird system. It was not to give it to the nation, but to another original institution. The Camondo family were called the Eastern Rothschild for a long time. They came mainly for Ottoman Empire. They settled in Paris during the Second Empire. And there were mainly two branches. One is very famous now with some wonderful painting in the Musée d'Orsay with Isaac de Camondo, a great friend of Monet and Degas. And the other branch was perhaps a bit more classical. That's the branch of Moïse. Moïse married Irène Cahen d'Anvers, so he was related to the Efroussi, the Cahen d'Anvers, the Alphen, all this great Jewish family, very important for philanthropy and art collecting in France at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. He got this piece of land near the Parc Monceau just before World War I. He destroyed the wonderful Second Empire Hotel Particulier of his parents that he didn't like, and asked Sergent to buy this kind of very clear homage to and tribute to 18th century Trianon, for example. And he decided to gather in this house his collection of 18th century, mainly late 18th century, small with the 16th. It's another way to collect. It was not so interesting in Middle Age and Renaissance artwork, not really Boulle furniture. It was really in the delight of Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI taste. The sad part of the story, as you know, and it was well remembered in the High with Amber Eyes of Edmond de Waal, who is related to the Camondo family through his grandparents. He had two kids, Nissim and Beatrice. Nissim died during the World War I as a fighter, a very brave hero in 1917. It was a way for Maurice de Camondo to focus his life on his collection. So, I mean, this idea of perhaps to make one day a museum from this collection starts then. His daughter, Beatrice, married a Rheinach family member. So Rheinach was very important scholars and philosopher and politician also at the end of the 19th century. The Villa Kerylos was the place of her in-laws, you know, perhaps this wonderful place in Beaulieu-sur-Mer, a Greek revival house. And when Maurice de Camondo started thinking of giving the museum and the collection to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, his daughter accepted it, because in the French law you cannot give to someone else than your kids more than a certain part of your fortune and of your estate. So she accepted this gesture of her father. She made respect the will of her father when he died in 1935. And as you know, she decided to stay in Paris during the Nazi occupation, and she was assassinated in Auschwitz with her two kids and her husband in 1943. So it's quite a strong story for a small museum like this, because it's like a family house. It was intended to be inhabited by 4 members, and I would say only 3 members, because Maurice de Camondo and his wife divorced very early, so it was basically Maurice and his 2 kids. And his will, because we talk about will and some restraints, his will was very clear, and it was accepted this way by the Board of Trustees of the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, is that nothing can be changed inside the house. No loans, no change of furniture, except with some exception. He decided himself before dying to transform one of the rooms of the house as a memorial to his son. So we have a kind of Nissim bedroom, which is not really his bedroom. It was an arrangement to make like a kind of family memorial. But the will is very strict and was since 1935 respected. Of course, the museum was closed at the declaration of war in 1939 and empty as any other French museum, and it was reopened after the war. And since then, we feel obliged, and I will say I deeply feel obliged to respect this will. I think that we will talk later about what that means today, but I think that it's the nature of the place, and as I told you, it was given to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, so we have another wonderful building on the Rue de Rivoli with wonderful temporary exhibition spaces, with wonderful design, craft, fashion collection. We can do blockbuster exhibitions that we all love, so that's fine. I think that this umbrella protects this place for, I would say, more radical change.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to some of the points you've raised, particularly the restraints that one might have with the will of one's founder. But before we do that, we're going to talk to a living collector who has also set up his own museum in Beugel. And so this is the Nissim Commando inside, yeah.
Very scholarly audience knows the place. You have the photographies done after the death of Maurice de Camondo, and you have some more actual vision. That's a famous memorial bedroom for his son Nissim, and the room as they are today. And here some not necessarily images that I put here to connect it with you, dear.
So, Chris, we're all hoping that your will not be so restrictive, but over to you.
Oh, well, I hope it doesn't come into force anytime soon, that's for sure. So, not in the next 10 minutes, anyway. So I'm Christian Levett, and I guess have the collecting gene, which some of us have, where you sort of go beyond doing something as a hobby, and it turns into somewhat of an obsession. And I started off as a child collecting very cheap Georgian and Victorian coins and First and Second World War campaign medals. There happened to be a shop in the street where I lived, and that sort of inspired the collecting there. And we had medals in the house from various people that had been in the military and their family, and that was sort of also an inspiration. Then I sort of went through sort of school and sports and that kind of thing, and then got into my 20s, went into the city, was working in London, became a commodities trader, and that led to me being sort of okay at that and making some money. And then in my 20s, I got into collecting. I just discovered I think on a day in Sutherland's one day, how beautiful hand-painted natural history books were. I started collecting those. I started buying artworks of various periods for an apartment in London. Then I lived in Paris for a while, so for the apartment there. Then I lived in Monaco for 5 years, and I bought some pieces for there. But it was mainly sort of for decorative reasons initially. I was buying Impressionist drawings, post-Impressionist drawings, started using the auction houses rather than just dealers. I started buying coins again, English medieval, Roman, Greek. And then I started buying antiquities. And I hadn't even realized that the antiquities market had existed until I was around 30 or so years old. And while I'd seen sort of small Greek vases and incidental pieces in coin sales and coin auctions and coin shops, etc., I had no idea that you could buy an ancient Greek helmet or a Roman bust and the kind of things you might see in the British Museum or the Louvre, for example. And then I sort of became fanatical about sort of collecting antiquities in the early 2000s. I also then started buying artworks that had classical themes to show at home alongside the antiquities. I'd also become interested in arms and armor as a sort of a follow-on from the sort of, I guess, the war theme of medals. And I've been buying some Cromwellian pieces, some medieval pieces, and then a large collection of ancient Greek and Roman armor came on the market in the early 2000s that have been collected between the 1970s and the year 2001 by a German chap called Axel Gutmann, who died in 2001, and then his family sort of liquidated that collection into the market, and I bought most of the best pieces from that collection. So I ended up by 2008, 2009 with so many antiquities in storage rather than at home, and a number of classically themed artworks, that I felt that the best thing to do was to get everything out of storage and then put it on public display. So I had a house, still have a house, in the village of Musée in the south of France. And that's why I then decided to have some kind of exhibition space, which then sort of fed into the idea of opening a museum, so that, one, the public could have access to the collection, because I wasn't really too sure whether or not people would be interested in seeing it, to be honest. When we opened, I didn't know whether we'd get thousands of visitors a year, or, sort of, two men and a dog would sort of wander in and out when they felt like it, kind of thing. I wasn't too sure whether anybody would be interested in loaning pieces from the collection, even though I'd had requests for loans and that kind of thing. But anyway, I thought that I would, rather than do the museum in London, I thought that we would do it in Musée, in the village where I had a home, and Musè's an interesting village in itself. Picasso spent the last 12 years of his life living in Musée and died in his villa in Musée. Jean Cocteau lived in Musée. Francis Picabia lived in Musée. Man Ray lived in Musée. Edith Piaf had a house in Musée. Christian Dior had a house in Musée. Winston Churchill visited Musée regularly and painted in the area. It also has a great culinary history. Alain Ducasse started his career in Musée. Roger Verger, the top chef in the world in the 70s and 80s, had 2 restaurants there. And Elizabeth Taylor started her Amphar parties in the late 1990s in a restaurant in Musée. So it's the most famous village in the world that nobody's ever heard of. And here is a picture of the old village. It's an old medieval village, and it's about 4 kilometers from Cannes. So that's the Bay of Cannes on the left, just in front of the village there. This is the sort of the back 4 floors of the building. It's quite a small building. It's only 600 square meters. But in fact, this is an old picture of actually when we first opened the first gallery. So it's over 4 floors, and we have the armory on the top floor. And then we have a variety of other floors where we have Roman marbles, Roman bronzes. We have a glass lift that goes through one end of the building, and then we have sort of 4-story high, almost glass cabinets, which have literally hundreds of objects in. And I've expanded particularly the art side of the collection, because it's just become much, much harder to buy antiquities in recent years of good provenance. And the idea of the museum in itself is that we show antiquities, Roman, Greek, and Egyptian antiquities, and ancient Italic, alongside artworks that have classical themes to them. So you can see how the classical period has influenced artists from the Baroque period through to today. So in this cabinet, for example, the small bronze statue in the back is by an early 18th century Italian artist called Soldani. The happy head in the front, the spin-painted skulls by Damien Hirst. There's a small Picasso classical plate of Jacqueline. And then you have 3 original Roman bronze heads. A bronze head, 2nd century AD of Apollo, 3rd century AD bronze head of an athlete, And the head on the right is a particularly important bronze head of Augustus that was found in Rome in 1885. That head we loaned to Cologne for an exhibition 2 years ago. Here's one of the upstairs galleries. Here we can see a Francis Picabia 1935 painting just in the front there. Beugel 19th century bronze sculpture in the front. Matisse drawing on the right. If we go forward, various Roman marbles. This is our funerary section containing sarcophagi panels and a lead Roman sarcophagus there with a Dufy painting of Orpheus and the animals and a small Liechtenstein architectural print there. Hopefully we get that's a poor view of this case on the left, but the case on the left has 3rd to 4th century BC ancient Greek vases, but it also has a Keith Haring vase, bottom left, 1982. Top left is a 1988 vase by Grayson Perry, which says a classical compromise on it. And then there's a Fontana / in terracotta just next to that. And then we have various Roman utility pieces on the right, silver, glass, etc. This is part of the armory. You can see a 4th century BC hoplite Greek soldier's shield in the front. On the far right, we have a Dame Elizabeth Frink bronze of a sort of classical Greek face and helmet. Actually, there's a Man Ray photograph of a Greek helmet on the right. This is our Egyptian gallery with various Egyptian marbles, Egyptian bronzes, cartonnage masks, sarcophagi. So this is I thought I'd include a few slides of some of the objects in the museum. So this is the bronze head of Augustus that I just talked about, with the various publications that it's been in going back to the 1880s on the left, and the provenance dating back to when it was found in Rome in 1880. Provenance being particularly critical when collecting antiquities, as much if not more than just about any other market. In fact, in the last 2 years, I've only actually managed to buy one antiquity that fits our increasingly tight provenance rules on provenance. This is a 2nd to 1st century BC Hellenistic bronze bowl. It was published and exhibited in 1904, and it's a particularly beautiful piece. Funny enough, bought that in Maastricht the March before last. This is an 8-foot high statue of the Emperor Hadrian with an 18th century provenance that originally came from Cobham Hall in Kent, then found its way over to America at one point, and I bought that in 2008 in an antiquity sale at Christie's in New York. But fantastic and rare piece. I think it's the only 8-foot high Roman statue, complete statue of an emperor that's come on the market in, I think, the last 30 years. This is the Crow Hall urn. This came at a Crow Hall near Bath, actually just about 7 or 8 years ago. It was a discovery by Christie's. They were doing a sort of house clearance of Crow Hall, which was this small sort of stately home. And someone spotted this with a big orange lampshade on the top. And at some point in the 1970s, someone had drilled a hole through the bottom and a hole through the top and electrified it. In fact, it was etched by Piranesi in the late 18th century and is a very important sort of lost Roman vase. So I bought that at Christie's in London. No, actually, I bought it from a dealer who bought it from Christie's in London just shortly after he bought it. So that's in the museum, for example. This is a statue of, well, she looks exactly like either Julia Titi or Domitia, the wife of Domitian. And we only have her provenance here back to 1906. She was in the royal family of Liechtenstein collection until they deaccessioned her in 1983 at a Sotheby's sale. But in fact, we now have her provenance back to 1824. We found a publication just last week with her in. So that was a nice find. This is a satire group, particularly spectacular group, and incredible condition given its sort of the delicacy of it. Also has an 18th century provenance. This was listed in the Medici archives going back to the 17th century, Egyptian fine statue of Bears. This statue here was once owned by Pope Urban VIII in the early 17th century. This came out of a 19th century French collection, important statue of Lucius Verus, etc., etc. This one's actually, the British Museum have just asked us to loan this. So that's going to their Troy exhibition next year. Has an 18th century provenance, statue of Odysseus. I'm conscious of time. Various sarcophagi, 4th century BC vases. This is one of the most important pieces in the Armoury collection. It's a 4th century BC Greek soldier's breastplate, and it's inscribed in ancient Greek, "For Athena, loot from the enemy." So someone would have killed somebody else on the battlefield, picked up his armor afterwards, inscribed it, dedicated it to Athena, and then either thrown it in a river or nailed it to a tree or a post of some kind. This is one of our helmets that's on loan to the Getty at the moment on a 2-year loan. And that is the story of Mougin in 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Maybe I should call you Chris Wallace, but you sound very much like a true collector who needs to do something with the collection and, of course, put it in a position where it can be enjoyed by not just you and your dear wife, but the public. And I think that's very important in the discussions we're going to have. Now, before we have our debate, I'm going to hand over to Jakob, who, of course, as a living artist, probably thinks we're all mad, but he is actually present here because he's very interested in Richard Wallace, his psychology as a collector, but also his own sort of pedigree almost. Who was he? Where did he come from? Was he indeed his father's son or not? And this is something that you might want to tell us more about in the work you've done previously, particularly at Chatsworth.
Slightly humbling to come after all those artworks and buildings, to say the least, so perhaps I should have gone first, Xavier. Anyway, a brief description of my education. I was an art historian at the University of York, and then I fell in love with ceramics and making, and I trained with Edmund de Waal, author and ceramicist Edmund de Waal, some 15 years ago, and have subsequently set up a studio in London and then in Cumbria and now in Devon. And I've always really been interested in themes that encapsulate the human condition. Here, this is a Memento Mori, which I thought tied in nicely with Dutch still life, 17th century paintings. And this was recently shown at the Tommaso Brothers Fine Art. And sort of, I've always been very interested in the context that my work sits in. In 2012, I was very fortunate enough to be awarded the commission to create a new, or to create some architectural ceramics for Chatsworth House. And it was really the first time that there's been any kind of significant addition to a Grade 1 listed building, or in fact, in Chatsworth House. The project morphed from creating small architectural ceramics into, I'm hoping on the strength of the design, an entire ceramic room. So what I did was I clad the entire space in handmade ceramic panels that accurately translates the mitochondrial DNA of the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire, their daughter-in-law and son, and something I call the every person portrait, which is a nod or acknowledgement towards the significance of visitors to Chatsworth House for its continued success and current success. So I wouldn't say it's subversive because the Duke and Duchess were very much on board, but it's basically it's looking it's not a form of anti-portraiture, but looking at identity in a different way, i.e. through ancestry, inheritance, and fusing contemporary knowledge of science in a an artistic way. And here's a detail. So really that idea of here, if you look at the block, it has these blocks actually represent the DNA, and you have a smooth component and a rough component. The smooth component being a metaphor for the perhaps one-dimensional nature that genetics gives when viewing identity and the self, and actually below the textured part is actually the history of the block, i.e. identity being a fusion of environment, history, and genetics. So my interest in genetics developed, and I became arts in residence at the Wellcome Sanger Institute, which is a world-leading genomics institute. And more recently, I've completed a project for the Chemistry of Health department at in Cambridge, where I depict Alzheimer's, which is the second from top row, in concrete, in aggregates, because Alzheimer's is a disease and an issue with protein aggregation. But we have normal aging at the top, Alzheimer's progression, and then treatment of Alzheimer's, or future hope of the building, and then below we have the prevention of Alzheimer's, all through the use of self-healing concrete, which is an amazing material, but definitely not for here. And here is another picture. So you might think that this is slightly contrived, but actually I would, i.e. my presence here is slightly contrived, but actually I would argue fundamentally that believing that the infinitude, I guess, of the soul is an illusion, and that we're far off abating senescence, i.e. biological aging, that actually there are few avenues open to achieving immortality, which is something I believe the human species craves for at its very heart, and is a motivating factor for much of the actions we see, amongst others, I guess. That one of the options available to us is through inheritance or legacy, be that through genetics and having children, or bequesting or philanthropy, and that really is the thread or the underpinning of my presence here, I feel. And I hope that will culminate in an exhibition that specifically, or a new body of work that looks into the idea of future-proofing the self, and whether this is folly, whether it's something that we all do unconsciously, and whether we should actually be looking at other ways of future-proofing the self. So, yeah, that's the bare bones.
No, very interesting. Particularly, I mean, at the moment, this is now talking about the Wallace. The Wallace were paying homage to the man who kept the collection together, and through his wife gave it to the nation. And I suppose we're going through a moment of trying to recommunicate with the public the identity of what the Wallace Collection is about. And I think it's something that, of course, that was his way of reaching some kind of immortality by handing over the collection, which could have easily been broken up through sale, but to keep it together and enjoyed by all. And I was wondering, from the Frick point of view, is that something that Frick had in mind?
Yeah, I mean, from the beginning, apparently, when he was building this house that was constructed between 1912 and 1914, it was a house that had a living room, dining room, and all of that, but he had in mind that it could be a place to show his collection permanently. So it is really the larger interesting question of a contemporary collector who is perhaps building for the present, for the future. We were talking about that. How much did Henry Clay Frick 100 years ago think about this? There's an economic factor. I mean, he left a will, a legacy. He planned that it would survive, and he got it more or less right. At least it lasted for 100 years before the Frick had to sort of dip into the till more. But you know, what is the place of private collections that become public now? I mean, how does the Frick's interests relate to Richard Wallace's? And you know, I think probably most of us have worked in big museums as well as small museums. I've worked at the Met, as you said, in the Art Institute of Chicago. More and more, I love the fact that these are places with a distinct personality, and that a lot of it has to do with scale, too. And fortunately, I think all of us here deal with collections that have to do with great quality. And you sort of need all of those ingredients, I think, if they're going to last. What I'm particularly concerned about at a place like the Frick now is that we more or less stop at 1900. The Musée des Arts Décoratifs kind of goes to the present. It always has, in a way. And I know that the Mauritshuis has been sort of thinking about programs dealing with contemporary art. What should we be doing? As we do have, Edmund Duval is going to be doing a project for us in 6 months. But I think more interesting is the challenge of how do you get a younger audience to head on take an interest in old master art. I think a lot of museums are sort of clutching at straws almost, hoping that a contemporary intervention might attract a younger audience. This was what Frick thought 100 years ago. He thought, and what Richard Wallace thought too, that the example of these objects would attract an audience. I mean, it was interesting to see Bethnal Green and his efforts really to reach a wider audience, and we're all talking about that in museums today. How do we reach a wider audience? But how do we do so in a way that doesn't compromise the quality of the collection and that gets people to sort of stop and slow down and look really closely at objects? And that's the big challenge.
And that's something that you were very interested in, Jakob, wasn't it? Sort of the idea of the slow art movement, is that right?
That's absolutely right. So I believe there's obviously a precedence for it, but there seems to be a necessity almost now to really slow the experience down, and that being a counterpoint to museums which have a very, very high turnover. There's a collector currently, I think it's the Glenstone Museum, which is a collection from Mitch and Emilie E.S, I believe, and they're very much collecting exactly what actually Richard Wallace was doing, and that Henry Frick was doing, was the best pieces, and obviously, but that actually it's not a 1 hour quick experience. It's actually a 5 hour experience, and it's actually, I think they're very they're different kind of approaches. It's more of a qualitative approach as opposed to a quantitative approach, which I think is very interesting.
Emilie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. That is what unites us all here. I should have said that I was trying to get my presentation done really quickly. So one of the things about the Mauritshuis is we only have 850 paintings. That's all. We have a little bit of decorative arts, but almost nothing else. And the building is very small. Now, the great blessing is the quality of this collection is so huge, so enormous, that we sort of play with the big boys in the museum world, and yet we can maintain that intimacy of scale of the building. The pictures themselves are not that big. I showed you the bull, but that's by far our biggest. So there is something about the combination, certainly we share this with the Frick, the combination of an intimate, sort of domestic interior, a collection that is extremely high in quality, but what makes the Mauritshuis different is we only do that one thing. We only do Dutch paintings. Now, that is a great blessing. You talked about my branding. It's very clear. Everyone knows what we do. That's what we do. But that is, in this age of increasing pressure on attendance, to grow your audience, to diversify your audience, it is also a great challenge. I have been working very hard to push the boundaries of thinking about what you can do with this collection, but still maintaining true to your mission and to your collection itself. So, for example, you mentioned I did invite for the first time in our 200-year history a contemporary artist to do a project. It was not an intervention, but it was in our temporary exhibition space. It was Vic Muniz, Brazilian artist, who did a whole display about the backs of paintings, very much in line with our research programming. We're one of the great conservation studios as well. Speaking of conservation, we've done a number of on-site conservation, we're hoping very innovative ways to share what's often very complicated technical research with a broad audience. And we're doing, I won't go into it, but too far into it, but we try to stay true to that core of that collection and yet be as innovative as possible in the presentation, in the exhibition space. And one last word, we have about 40% of our visitors are foreigners and about 60% are Dutch citizens. And we do our programming, these temporary exhibitions we do to get repeat visits from our Dutch audience and to diversify our Dutch base. But our tourists, they come for the highlights of the permanent collection.
I mean, there's something, we were talking about wills. In the Lady Wallace's wills, she says that the collection, the Wallace Collection, should be styled the Wallace Collection. So unfortunately, I can't rebrand and call it the WC or anything like that, unlike the Mauritshuis. But talking about wills, I mean, you're very lucky. You've got the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, which means you can express your artistic fire, while the Nissim Kamando remains a quiet place. I mean, how many people go to the Nissim Kamando?
Not so many, 60,000 visitors a year. But I'm not sure it's about my own artistic energy. It's about certainly my board of trustees' attention. Of course, they are looking at numbers, and the French government is looking at numbers too. So I think that we are lucky to be in a two-side museum, because the Musée des Arts Décoratifs on Rivoli, as soon as you do a Christian Dior exhibition, you're safe, you know. Nobody is going to look after the Musée Nissim de Kamando to look at the numbers, you know. So I think that's an important point. That's true that regularly some member of the Board of Trustees, since I'm here for 5 years, but I heard that it was previously, try to look carefully at the wheel to see if there is any change. And sometimes people can be very cynical because there is no more family. So certainly not Auschwitz phantoms will, you know, say that we cannot do that. So I think that there is a kind of sacred mission at one point to say, okay, no, we should respect. I'll give you an example. When I arrived, we were organizing a beautiful French lacquer exhibition at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs, and my predecessor accepted that some pieces of furniture from Kamando come to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs by saying, well, they're more or less the same building. And I say, we stop here immediately. They are staying here. It's not, I mean, it's a vision of the wheel which is totally obnoxious because it's totally untrue. And that's true that, but you are also, with this problem with loan, I'm always surprised. You know, a few years ago, there were a big retrospective on Madame Vigée-Lebrun, and the curator, who is a very enlightened French curator, quite a bit snobbish, say, I will ask the Vigée-Lebrun. I say, no, it's not possible. I say, I'm quite surprised you don't know that, you know, because it's that's historical. That's for almost, 80 years. So nobody never learned. So why I should do this for you? And just say to your visitors to come to the Musée Nissim de Kamando to see two wonderful portraits by Madame Vigée-Lebrun. It's perfectly fine. It's open almost every day, so it's very easily to access. And I think that it's something that sometimes I think there is always a kind of paradox around these kind of places, because people always privilege, and I love your idea of slow art, because we know we have slow design, but we should defend slow museum. There is some different organic rhythm according to the place where we are. And I think that I'm always surprised with discussion with people saying, oh, I love going to the Musée Kamando. It's so quiet, so peaceful. We should bring more people. I say, well, so it's really not at all the same experience for sure. Because of course you are in a house, and it's different from here or the Frick. We did a big job for the last 2 decades to reopen all the services and the domestic spaces, the bathroom, the kitchen. It seems to be very popular. People come to the museum to see this because, guys, I'm not lucky as you are. We have, I told about Vigée-Lebrun, we have no great old masters. I mean, Maurice de Kamando was a collector of decorative arts, so wonderful furniture, safe porcelain, silver, everything that is supposed to be today quite out of fashion for young people coming to museums. So we can even pretend to say that we have a wonderful self-portrait by Rembrandt, a wonderful Vermeer. We don't have this level of master. So it's another big tricky things. But at the end of the day, I think that I'm always surprised that the board of trustees from time to time wake up and say, oh, we should do something more. And as soon as they explain that, okay, we can do temporary exhibitions, that mean fundraising money to do exhibitions, that mean finding a place inside the building to do an exhibition. And they are in a way lazier than I am, so they stop very often very quickly on this reflection.
Thank you, Olivier. I mean, Ian, you're about to close in 2020. What are you going to do with the collection while you're closed?
Well, that gets back to the question of will, because Frick's will, as it's been interpreted, is that we can't lend anything that he bought. So he dies in 1919. When we received from the Mauritshuis the wonderful girl with the pearl earring and the goldfinch, we saw this tidal wave coming towards us, immense interest in that, and we agreed to do an exhibition that went to the Mauritshuis, which was drawn entirely from things that were acquired after Frick's death. And I think it was a good exhibition. You did very well.
It was wonderful, and it shows you that the quality of the works that you've been collecting since Frick's death is extremely high. It was almost a surprise to us in a good way, and our audience loved it.
So there's several points there. One is, so the will is written 100 years ago, and it's usually written within the terms of what's accepted at the time. So 100 years ago, sending works of art was more difficult. It was hard to pack things, climate control, all of that. So there were a lot of strictures on loans in New York museums. So when we're now at the point where, at the Frick, for its future preservation, a lot of it has to do with infrastructure, replacing the skylights, the new heating and air conditioning system. The electrical systems haven't been updated since 1935. I mean, there's a lot that we need to do to protect the collection for the future. So I've spent a couple of years with lawyers making sure that we can actually lend our pictures outside of the house. And I was looking for space within New York City where we might be able to show part of our collection. So while we were closing, I knew at that point we were going to have to close for 2 to 3 years to do all of this infrastructure. So I went to 12, 14 different museums, cultural institutions, sort of hat in hand, looking for a gallery or something like that. And I had some interesting proposals. It never occurred to me that the Met and the Whitney would be willing to give the Met Breuer to us entirely. But that's what's happened, and it's actually cost effective. And so it raises these really interesting points. First, you know, we've satisfied ourselves that Frick's will accommodate us to preserve the collection for the future by this move. But now we're sort of really also intrigued, what will the collection look like? Pulled away, imagine the Wallace Collection on brutalist walls of a 1966 building in New York. The Frick very much is a part of the background, the context. What will our great Giovanni Bellini look like on a plain wall? And you know, the good thing is it's going to come back, and it will come back into the environment which everybody knows and loves and which we want to preserve. But it gives us this extraordinary opportunity to kind of rethink it, look at it in a new way. We're having endless debates now, but it's quite an opportunity, really, to be able to rethink the entire collection.
I mean, well, Jacob, you're about to say something, but I was going to say, I mean, Chris, you're very generous with your collection. You like to see your collection elsewhere, juxtaposed with other objects. It's something that you believe in.
Yeah, very much so. I think that, I mean, one of the major strengths, because we only get 20,000 visitors a year, so not so many, but one of the major strengths of our museum, I think, and that's sort of qualified the quality of the collection, if you like, is the amount of loans that we give to other museums. So, we have 2 helmets on loan, 2 Roman helmets to the Met, for example, on 4-year loans at the moment. The helmet that was in the presentation, the Shield Boss, on 2-year loans to the Getty. Like I said, we've got a loan coming up to the British Museum next year. Last year we loaned 5 Roman cavalry helmets to the Roman cavalry exhibition along Hadrian's walls. That was Newcastle, Tully House, Vindolanda. We loaned a tomb rubbing by Belzoni, who discovered the Valley of the Kings, to the Sir John Soane Museum last year. We've loaned to Cologne. We've loaned to Brunswick in Germany. We've loaned to the local museums like Nice and Marseille, Lyon. We're loaning 20 items to a museum, to the Roman Museum in Arles for a Roman army exhibition that starts in December. So that's December to April. We loaned Modigliani drawings last year, 2 drawings of caryatids to the Jewish Museum in New York. We loaned 2 Cézanne drawings to the Museum in Massigny in Switzerland last year.
Basically, you're a very generous lender.
Yeah, so
I got the message.
So,
But,
well, one thing as a collector, it kind of, you know, when you sort of buy things, you don't really know whether anybody else is going to be interested in seeing them. You know, you just buy them because you're interested in seeing them. There's something about them that excites you, whether it's kind of academic importance or beauty or both. So out of everything to do with the museum, I'd just say that that's the thing that's kind of excited me the most. The fact that other museums and distinguished, you know, curators have asked us for loans consistently, and so we're very happy to do that. I think it's fantastic.
Jacob, you were going to say something.
Thank you, Xavier. What fascinates me here at the Wallace is this very strict adherence to the will, or the perceived perceptions of the will, because it's very clear to me, having sat through the conference, that actually Richard Wallace lent extensively during his lifetime, and there's a, to go slightly off point, there's a very interesting book by Will Self called the Book of Dave, and it's this religion, or this occultist society that grows up from a book that was buried, or a diary that was buried by a taxi driver, and which was then unearthed 3,000 years later. And there's this sort of strict adherence to this very bizarre taxi driver who led a very sort of depraved life, and etc. But it's to me, it feels like there's a danger of this very strict adherence to a very narrow view of something that can actually hinder the natural evolution of a place. Not necessarily that it morphs into a kind of a mutated version, but it prevents a kind of a growth that is, I guess, essential to cope with changes in the environment.
No, very interesting. I mean, we've had Nissim Kamando, nothing's going to change at Nissim Kamando. That we have a moment where the Frick is going to see what it looks like outside its own walls, which I think will be like looking into the mirror, and good luck. I'm sure it's going to look amazing, but it will definitely be another context. And, you know, speaking on behalf of the Wallace, I mean, the will is very interesting. It does say that the collection shall always remain together and unmixed with other objects. And in the context of the last 2 days, it's very much about the identity of the collection, that it is a collection that was brought together, that it shouldn't be broken up, that it should be kept for future generations together, to be looked at together. And unmixed, you know, is probably all about not adding a Frick collection or Nissim Kamando collection to keep it very much, keeps its identity very much together. And I don't know how you feel as Frick, Nissim Kamando, the idea of identity, I think it's, or the idea of branding, it's something that's, and I don't know if you one day will change the Musée d'Art Classique to the Levett Museum. Is that something that's ever occurred to you, to actually put your name in? Sorry, that's a very direct question, but would you ever think of doing such a thing?
Well, I wouldn't change the name now. I mean, I thought about that initially, and
to call it the Levett Museum?
Well, I mean, it crossed my mind for all of about 10 seconds. I mean, the two decisions were, you know, really location, whether to do it in London or whether to do it in Musée. I also had the summer house, and whether to name it sort of after myself or give it a broader name. And I thought that I would just sort of keep it lowish key, do it in the south of France, so it didn't create the sort of, I wasn't quite sure how the press would take it, to be honest, because you know, as a commodity trader and hedge fund manager, you know, I didn't know whether the press would say, like, you know, who's this guy? He's built this big collection. Now he's opening a museum in London. You know, who the hell does he think he is, Wallace or someone? You know, or you know, and so I thought I'd tuck it away in the south of France, and I thought I'd, you know, name it as it is. You know, the Museum of Classical Art, which sort of describes what's inside it. And it was as simple as that, really.
Emily.
I want to come back to this, your slow art thing, and say something very extremely practical, which is there is a real tension for all of us, I think, as museums, depending a little bit on the context, to look at attendance, how many people you want to have come visit. I am a bit of a rebel in my country because I am not keen on getting as many people as I can through the door. It's not, I think it makes for a terrible visit. We've all had the experience of being 10 deep in front of a painting. And as I said earlier, I'm looking for repeat visits. So we work very hard on hospitality. The Netherlands is not always the most friendly in terms of a culture. So we work really hard to make sure everyone's friendly and that you get all the information you want so that the totality of the visit is very positive. And that includes not getting too many visitors, so it's too stuffed. But there's an inherent tension there because you also have to make some money. So for you, I think, Xavier, one of the challenges is going forward, how do you preserve that sense of slow art, of intimacy, and yet make your numbers? And I think that is something that all of us, as museums go farther along and times they get older, you know, or I think ours is the oldest here, you see that the museum landscape or the economics around your political landscape changes. And so you have to, I think of a model that will grow with your time. Not only that the art itself, in our case, old masters, appeal to younger audiences, but also that the foundations are secure.
I mean, out of all of you lot, we're the only one that doesn't charge. So anybody can walk in for free, which is wonderful. But, you know, how do you turn that into the necessary funds?
It's kind of interesting what I note. In the Netherlands, if it's something for free, they think it's not worth going to. So it's a totally different mentality.
No, but I totally agree with this. You know, the world changed, the museum changed. That's fine. But I love the idea that some museum don't need to change so much, you know. And he sounds very conservative because no. We just redesign or design galleries. We're doing a lot of mediation. We fundraise money. That's okay. But I love that in the world of today, we try to keep some examples that are relevant, were relevant 1 century ago, will certainly be relevant in 1 century from here. And I'm not sure that some very modern and hyper new equipped museum will be, because we have to change every 20 years. So it means that here you have to change more than 1 century later, even if there is, I guess, small change since that. That's the same for us. So this model was not so bad. I mean, the world changed a lot, so it looks sometimes a bit old and a bit like out of fashion. But again, you know, we do a lot of activity in the museum. There is a lot of kids coming. It's a house. It was a family house, so we keep the spirit of the family house. I love the way when my board of trustees say, "Oh, we should have bring more audience to the museum." I say, "Okay, but the staircase is done for a family of 4 and 15 domestics. So one day we will close the place and we'll change the staircase." So, what do you think about ticketing? I'm sure it's the same here. We have administrators; they have their own career, so they say, "Okay, if the numbers are good in the 5 forthcoming years, that will be nice for me because I will leave for someone else, somewhere else, and I don't care." But at the end of the day, the building is the same, and the museum is still there. And what you decide at one point will be perhaps not relevant 10 years later. And I think that in that way, I feel very comfortable because in the Rue de Rivoli we are doing wonderful exhibition, design, contemporary design, and Dior and whatever. But I love the idea that, and there's the same person in charge, that we keep the spirit in that place, and I think that's what people look after when they come to the museum.
I think it'd be really interesting actually to talk about the Barnes Foundation, which might be, I'm slightly concerned that it's divisive. I'm sure it's not, and really explore so the Albert Barnes who created foundation. It's sort of his whole ethos of slow art, which was paramount to his philosophy, has been entirely eviscerated. From what I can gather, and the perils, I guess, of this very idea of this very immersive experience and qualitative experience does, I guess, have a perilous quality to it, in the sense that it can sort of on the outside be perceived as elitist, when in fact all you're trying to achieve is just a quality. And I wonder how you wrestle with that notion of quality and not wanting to be perceived as elitist.
This is a huge topic for us. We get our subsidy on the basis of being open to everybody. So you have to tread a fine line. And I think that that will be the challenge for all of us here in one way or another. I mean, I don't have the great aegis of the Musée des Arts, as you say, de Rivoli to help. So you have to find a way. I mean, you have to be practical and find a way to get people through the door and make sure that in 50 years, people have been to as you did, came to the Mauritshuis when you were young, so that you want to come back later. And that means appealing to new audiences. I mean, that's just a fact. And yet you try to preserve the best that you can. So it depends, I think, on the institution, but it's a big challenge for all of us.
I thought we should get you to ask a few questions, but to be honest, what I'm going to say is a bit not revolutionary, but if you really want us to survive as a small house museum, you guys have got to help us, because the government is not going to help us, and it very much is the public. So it's all very well to say, stay as you are, but this is a plea from the director. If you want us to stay as we are, we do need help from a general audience, and I think that's very important, especially if we are going to stay for free. Don't take us for granted, and I hope you all think the same.